So my first question is, since our last interview, what new realities in global apparel sourcing have emerged and that industry leaders were not enough prepared for?
I would say, well, first of all, let me just say thank you for the invitation, Aki, to participate. This is a great honor and a pleasure. So I appreciate the invitation. But to directly answer your question, I think one of the things that we're seeing more than ever is a resurgence in mercantilism, very old term, and we're seeing basically the will of strong nations imposing their will, I should say, on smaller nations. And I think that degree of one-sidedness, it's a very old-fashioned kind of approach to, I mean, this is very 19th century and earlier kind of approach. It's very, in some ways, it's quite imperialistic. And I think what we're seeing, in a stepped up degree that we hadn't seen. And I think the industry, we got a picture of it with tariffs, but now we're seeing it play out in different parts of the world in very potentially combative and very difficult ways, which does not support the peaceful trade of commerce in the long run. So again, I think that's something that the industry probably now is looking at or has to look at in a more comprehensive way than perhaps everyone was focused tariffs like they should have been. But now we're seeing it's tariffs plus a very different government policy from what we've seen previously in a very focused manner. And all of that can take place in any number of ways, but we're seeing some profound examples right now in the world. And it's disturbing if one is trading in products like clothing and textiles.
So my second question is to you, beyond tariffs and trade policy, what deeper structural weaknesses in the global apparel supply chain are now being exposed?
I think there's a tendency, it's a tendency at times in business. It's certainly a tendency with human nature. If things are working a particular way and it's going well, and there's no reason to change from the way business practices have been conducted, I think when there's a shock to the system, and the shocks can come in any number of different ways. I think one of the things that we've seen is that it's been difficult for some companies to pivot and make adjustments rapidly. I think they've also been kind of caught with the tariffs in particular and a degree of uncertainty. I think it's become more significant than it was even a year ago. Because again, as it's played out, it's illustrated that companies need to really diversify, and the ones who haven't been able to diversify successfully are struggling at the moment, and they're saddled with higher costs. They're saddled with perhaps a um, flat consumption for their products. So as a result, it's kind of carving out profitability. And for a time, companies certainly were willing to absorb some of that, the tariff costs. But now I think it's coming home in a way that may have caught people little off balance going into 2026.
Okay, thank you. Sustainability is widely discussed, but execution remains uneven. Where do you see the largest gap between sustainability ambition and real-world impact?
I feel bad for the sustainability people. Uh, these are passionate folks, people who've been, they're in companies, I mean, and they work in the NGOs. These are passionate people who have really put everything they have into trying to help our industry to clean itself up and to be less of a impact on the environment. But I think along with that, I think there's a sense, particularly with many of the brands, that these are extra costs, and at this time they can be really difficult costs for them to absorb, like they were in the past. And it's not just simply marketing. I mean, I think many brands really do believe to try to do a better job with their supply chains and working with their supply chain partners to produce more sustainably. But again, I think that's cost up and down a supply chain that's under price pressures right now because of tariffs and a weak market. And so I think it's a difficult time for people in the whether it's ESG or sustainability, as I was referring to it. It's a difficult time to be in that position in the industry. And because I think the challenge at the end of the day is how do those programs build value for a company? And I think that's going to be more important than ever for advocates of sustainability to make to their companies. It's going to be I think it's going to be hard for the moment.
Okay. Circularity is often positioned as the future of fashion. What is realistically required to scale circular business model beyond pilot projects?
Yeah, I think again, I think it comes back to cost, and it comes back to a lot of those people say, well, it comes back to will. Well, to a degree, on the part of communities and countries and companies to really adopt those approaches and to adopt them in a real way that's not just some marketing thing. So, but I think the problems at the end of the day, much with just sustainability in general, is just the added cost. And of course, the political climate, particularly in my part of the world, has not helped matters any as far as the circularity initiatives, let alone sustainability initiatives. The political environment is just very anti any of that. And as long as that's in place, it's going to make it even harder for anything to scale. I'm not saying it won't happen. I mean, I certainly hope it does happen. But but as I look and try to be realistic about what's out there, it's a tough run, and there's not a lot of big support coming out of the government here, out of the U.S. So as a result, you have the maybe the largest consumer market in the world, or I don't know if it still has that, but if it does, it's if there's just no push publicly and supported by government policies, there's just a portion of the population is just never going to care. It's just because at the end of the day, they're out to buy a garment and they want it to be cheap. So, that's sort of the pressure that they're facing. Other parts of the world could be different. Certainly in Europe, it's different because there's a commitment to try to do something, and they have been doing something, but it's difficult here in the States.
Yeah, you're right. As ESG expectation intensify, how will supplier evaluation and sourcing decisions change over the next 5 years?
Um, I think as long as the current policies, trade policies in particular, and the long supply chains that the industry have are intact to some degree, even though it may be more scattered around the world than it was, say, in previous years. I think it's going to be a hard, as long as those are in place 5 years from now, we may find that we've actually stepped back in many ways with regard to ESG. I think that's an unfortunate prognostication on my part, but and it's what I'm not happy about. But it's just very difficult to see unless there's some new initiative and there's some new approach to improving, policies being set where there's very strong support for environmental and ESG initiatives. I'm just a bit pessimistic with regard to 5 years from now, whether that's going to be a factor. I think people are going to be in this environment. They're going to be concerned about if the market can grow. There's questions if it can. Uh, you talk to one economist says the market's fine, and then the next one you talk to says it's horrible. No one really knows. It's kind of But if I were to look out and say in the next 5 years, unless there's some policy changes with regard to that, I don't see much changing, unfortunately.
Okay, okay. With cost pressures rising, is the industry at risk of deprioritizing sustainability? And how can long-term commitments be protected then?
Yeah, again, that's a great question, and again, it falls back to a number of the things that you've asked me previously, and
Right.
I've been kind of echoing through this is the difficulties of adopting sustainable measures, particularly if there are costs associated with it. The value proposition is a very difficult one to sell to, particularly brands at this point. They're just not looking to add costs anywhere. They're dealing with squeezed margins. In many cases, they're also concerned about their market offtake, their ability to continue to sell product. So again, I think there's things like sustainable initiatives, ESG as well. Those types of initiatives, I think, are increasingly being pushed aside for the moment because it's a cost that there's just not a willingness for companies to absorb, I should say. And in many cases, yeah, they're basically trying to avoid those costs for now. So I think it harms the effort because if some companies, if they do keep those initiatives in place, I think it's a lot of marketing and not a lot of substance. And I think that's not going to do the industry any good in the long run. But on the short run, it's uh, it's the unfortunate facts of the way the industry and the way the business is right now. So it's tough. And so again, as I do see that as something that's going to be under pressure for advocates, it's going to be a more of a value proposition for companies. In other words, where if they take it on, and there's some sort of a cost savings that comes from greater efficiencies and greater utilization of resources. I suspect there'll be a lot of talk about bringing in AI solutions to help companies run more efficiently, run more effectively, to save money, and at the same time be a better steward for the environment. That's all definitely possible. It's just it takes time. That's a lot to say, and that's a lot to implement for people. So, but again, I think yeah, it's a tough road at the moment.
Uh, my last question is, in an increasingly tense geopolitical environment, how should global sourcing and trade strategies adapt to uncertainty and instability?
As I learned in the cotton business, hedge, hedge, hedge. So I think diversification is going to be really key. I think companies are going to need to look at a variety of new sourcing strategies. Some will be nearshoring, some will be traditional sourcing, some will be more sourcing from regions where companies haven't been involved with that much. I think the industry for a long time got spoiled because China was frankly a great single source. I mean, they did a terrific job. I mean, they basically, as the industry grew globally, it was frankly because of a very effective Chinese industry and infrastructure. I mean, it was hard to compete with that. But as things have changed in the world, and as a lot of new pressures have been brought to bear, and as we can see in even the basic trade numbers, the Chinese industry is diversifying itself. It's clearly investing elsewhere in particularly in Southeast Asia and other places. But I think along with that will require on the part of buyers and brands and retailers to expand their own horizons with regard to not just settling into one or two suppliers, but having to develop a far more elaborate matrix where they're sourcing from different parts of the world as a hedge to disruptions and shocks that may occur because of the geopolitical situation, just because of just normal problems of doing trade, economics. I mean, all those factors get thrown into the same bucket, and it affects every company. And as so many companies learned, they were caught flat-footed with the tariffs that came out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere. And now as they also learned during COVID, when the pandemic hit, it caught everybody unprepared. How can you plan for that, right? So it's a very having a wider net will provide more options if, in fact, we find that certain regions have to be adjusted. Their sourcing has to be adjusted in favor of others. Establishing those global relationships now is going to be really important. Nearshoring is, again, as I mentioned, is probably going to be part of the mix. Reshoring depends on the product, maybe some, but again, I think it's more likely nearshoring in terms of having some degree of carve out in the sourcing matrix will be kind of in the mix. But again, in terms of broader, many people are looking at Africa now. Many people have changed their sourcing patterns even throughout Asia. There's more countries involved, and again, I just think that's sort of the smart play going forward.